Well, welcome to a webinar that we hope is insightful around creating respectful outreach materials. This is geared really toward provider agencies, but we're going to spend a little time also looking at what employers expect from the way that we communicate. I'm Doug Crandall with the UCED at the University of Georgia. I'm joined today by Nancy Brooks Lane from Griffin Hamas, and you'll be seeing both of us presenting today. All right, well, tell the valued story. That's what we're here to talk about. And to be able to do that, we have to create a foundation, a baseline. I started in supported employment services when we focused on just sounding like we were a temp agency. And we've had several iterations of the way that employment services are communicated, both to internal customers as well as external. So we have two different sets of language and expectations when it comes to the way that we communicate services, supports, both to job seekers and their families and loved ones, as well as to the community at large and employers. So it's a pretty big bite to take. But to get started, we want to think about what is being communicated. As human beings, we're always telling stories. In fact, there's an old adage that you're either creating stereotypes or reducing them. There's nothing neutral. So everything from the way that we email to large-scale fundraising sends a message, and everything in between. Waiver or vocational rehabilitation funders and providers and those trade associations that represent them were steeped in this lingo that's really thick, and we don't often recognize that we're taking that language and lingo out into the way that we engage employers and the community at large. So it's really important first to be cognizant, aware that we're doing that. But then that presents a real challenge, right? Because how can you be person-centered, individualized, focused on a specific job seeker? Because we also represent programs, whether that is a service or a support, or many times it's a provider organization that's known in their community. And that messaging is happening all the time. A couple of years ago, we were working with an organization that had wanted to really improve their mental health supported employment program. And if you're aware of IPS, individual placement and supports, there's obviously core principles related to that service. And this provider was really excited to get going and get moving, and they had an agency brochure that they used to give to employers. And on the back of the brochure, it listed all 8 core principles of IPS. Now, if you know anything about that, that's really internal language. One of the core principles is that the person has access to an interdisciplinary team, including ACT teams and crisis case management. That's a weird thing to be communicating to employers. That's a program. That's not something that we use to engage employers. Obviously, the most person-centered you can get in engaging employers is using some type of visual resume, whether that's video or photo-based, along with some text. But again, if we use a brochure or a website, we have to focus on the individualized stories and much less about programmatic focus. Again, that's everything from language to the way that we describe our supports. So we got to figure out how to get there, right? And it makes sense to spend some time on really thinking through the foundation and the basis. And that's what we want to do today. So obviously, person-centered thinking must be part of the basis. It's got to be the foundation. So many times in our systems, we take a very powerful concept and then water it down so that it doesn't have the strength and outcomes that it should. Social role valorization, which Nancy's going to cover, is really important when it relates to imagery, right? Those kinds of roles that we occupy say a lot about us, whether we are part of a program or not. So we'll also spend some time thinking about a little bit of the employer focus and individualized stories. There's a movement afoot as well to do a better job, and Judy Heumann has spent some time on this, encouraging mainstream media to embrace well-told stories. And the best way to get to that, to truly be person-centered and something we're going to offer up in this webinar, is really valuing lived experience when we're creating communications. And of course, that means enlisting people who use the services informally as well as formally, which we'll spend some time on. But this is the foundation of trying to move past some communications that can be sometimes not very individualized. Well, language is the way that we think through words and images and symbols. That's just the way we are as creatures. So much of that happens and we're not even aware of it. Obviously, person-centered thinking embraces people first language, but we should always, as professionals, make sure that we have lived experience informing really anything that we're doing, but certainly the way that we, if you use the term market or engage employers. The system words and phrases like caseload and treatment team, and we could go on here with the language, but that creates distance, not only from a real job seeker, but from employers and small businesses and the community at large. So being aware is one of the very first steps, that we are immersed in acronyms and lingos, and that reinforces who is in control, and it creeps into our communications. So I guess you could consider these 4 bullets kind of some assumptions as we move forward in taking on this topic. Well, story is important because, again, if you spend any time eavesdropping, listening, we don't get to do that as much as we did in person. But if you do, you realize we're always telling stories to one another. The most basic is, how was your day? But story informs how we think about person-centered thinking. We don't view people as somehow problematic or deficient, people that need to be fixed, right? That's a lot of our system. It's very strange to work in a system where we have to be able to qualify somebody for services and supports by focusing on their deficits, but turn around and focus on strengths and gifts and endearing traits. Low expectations are obviously created by our systems. And in this approach, when we think about person-centered thinking, we're replacing that with positive outcomes, with positive imagery. Story, particularly in the services around employment, is ever evolving because a job's not a one-time event, it's a career. So that tells us that we've got to embed these tools along the way. Everybody should be included in the career planning and person-centered thinking. Knowing someone's story is a remedy to thinking about someone as a client or a consumer or a disability label. We were recently involved in a state funder trying to decide in their policies and procedures how they would refer to someone using the services. Finally settled on job seeker. Big surprise. Okay. I'm going to turn this over to Nancy now, and she's going to take some time to look at some guiding principles, some social role valorization, just to continue to give us the values base before we get into a little more of using the lived experience. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Brooks Lane now.
Doug and I felt it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the principles and values tied to this work that we do that aren't specific to the marketing piece in the sense that wasn't why they were developed. it was more holistically. They were developed because should guide us in everything we do to help people with disabilities have inclusive lives. So these are the CRC guiding principles, and they reflect person-centeredness, every single one of them. And if you're not familiar with what CRC stands for, it comes from the Commission on Rehabilitation Counselor Certification. The CRCC offers a national certification program. You may have seen signatures of vocational rehabilitation counselors with a CRC after their name. That means that they passed the exam and earned the right to use the designation of certified rehabilitation counselor. So let's go through these. Respecting human rights and dignity, ensuring the integrity of all professional relationships, acting to alleviate personal distress and suffering, enhancing the quality of professional knowledge and its application to increase professional and personal effectiveness, promoting empowerment through self-advocacy and self-determination. Just a few more right here. Appreciating the diversity of human experiences and appreciating culture, emphasizing client strengths versus deficits, serving individuals holistically, and advocating for the fair and adequate provision of services. Those are just great principles, pardon me, that tie into the values that we work under or with or through or alongside. So I've also included principles that guide our work, utilizing best practices and evidence-based practices. The principles include normalization, social role valorization, disability etiquette, people first language, and cultural respect and humility. I'm going to go into more detail with principles of normalization, social role valorization, and people first language. So before we leave this slide, let me just define the other two boxes. Disability etiquette is a set of guidelines for respectful communication and interactions with people with disabilities. And there is so much great information on the internet if you Google disability etiquette. And the same for cultural respect and humility. Again, if you Google those terms, you're going to find so much helpful information. Cultural diversity involves understanding and honoring the values and beliefs of diverse cultures. Cultural humility goes one step further. It involves empathetic understanding of each other's viewpoints and backgrounds, almost walking in each other's shoes, to use an overly used trite cliche. So let's dig into normalization. This is a principle that was made part of our revolution in helping individuals to have inclusive lives. Normalization simply means that individuals with disabilities have the rights and opportunities just as individuals without disabilities. Housing, education, employment, recreation, choice. And at the time, this was just off of the institutional or beginning of the deinstitutionalization movement. And it was radical. It seems so grounded in who we are now that that it's become normal. Normalization has become normal in our work. Social role valorization. It's defined as the use of culturally valued means to enable, establish, enhance, maintain, and defend valued social roles for people at value risk. And those are all Wolfensberger's unique ways of talking about disability. Social role valorization ties into helping a devalued person. And we're talking about individuals with disabilities and often the elderly, individuals in our culture who are pushed to the fringe, individuals living in poverty. It's defined as the use of culturally valued means, as I said, in the definition, to help individuals maintain and discover valued social roles. And it should be one of the most important goals of any organization and the staff who work in those organizations who care about individuals with disabilities. So negative roles, just to contrast and go a little bit deeper, is roles that are not valued and they're fraught with bias, such as eternal child, dangerous, uneducable, unemployable. Valued roles are relationships such as friends, neighbors, family, work, employee, coworker, team member, and citizens, voter, club member, neighborhood group member, part of a spiritual community, renter, homeowner. It goes on and on. So the important piece to understand are that valued roles are the key to individuals having inclusive lives. And people first language, that involves avoiding describing a person as a label. When there's reason to speak of an individual's disability, speak of the person first, not the disability first. So we think of the phrasing that you may have heard over and over is person with a disability, not person is disabled. And then the individual is respected as a person first, with disability being one aspect of who they are.
All right, well, Nancy reviewed the role of social role valorization, the disability etiquette, people first language. All of that plays into obviously the most important thing, which is supporting folks, but also in the way that we engage the community. We wanted to add to those three foundational pieces, something that's been really useful for us in both training and helping agencies kind of think about what they're communicating and spending some time on that. The National Center on Disability and Journalism is housed at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University, and there's a wealth of information there. So just some tips to use this website the best that you can and utilize it. There are obviously some style guides that you can download there, but keep this in mind. Many organizations try to get some coverage for their programs or their services, and we've all read some articles or even seen some video productions where there's a lot of stereotype stuff going on. There's not much thought about those socially valued roles. So, you know, one great tip here is to take the National Center on Disability and Journalism and bookmark it, save it to your desktop. When you're reading your local media or national media, if someone tells a respectful story, oftentimes the reporter's there and you can just email and thank them for that. You can also send this, because it's housed within journalism, to journalists who maybe not have followed the style guide and maybe haven't done as good a job portraying someone. The reason that works better than just our advocacy lens is because, again, this is a well-respected journalism school. So there's tons of resources there. We add to that as we're thinking about doing engagement of employers and to really use this well. I wanted just to share another quick anonymous story. We were working in the last year with a state funding agency. who, like many state agencies, send out monthly newsletters and communications. And they chose during a worldwide pandemic to focus on an enclave of people, 8 or 9 folks, with the labels of intellectual and developmental disabilities, volunteering to clean up the parks and rec, again, during the pandemic. That is a great example of not understanding social role valorization, good services. They chose to amplify that story. When you amplify a story like that and somebody in the community, maybe an employer, maybe a regular citizen, sees 8 people doing that, they assume that, well, that's all that somebody can do. So this is powerful, and what we choose to amplify is so powerful as well. We've turned to both in our training around customized employment, and then certainly in this topic today, creating respectful outreach materials, to rely on Burton Blatt's storytelling truths. They're adapted and a little edited here, but Burton Blatt was responsible for Christmas in Purgatory, which was a pictorial examination of 3 different awful institutions in the 60s, really snuck in along with Fred Kaplan into these institutions to take secret photos and try to reveal what our country was doing to folks. Again, as Nancy said, pushed to the fringe, devalued. And as Blatt continued to study and try to understand what it meant to have a disability, particularly intellectual and developmental disability in the United States, he wrote tremendous amounts of just essays, and he was a poet as well, along with scholarly writing. But he came up with these truths, and these are really important to kind of understand. This is a foundation as well, that people have the right to tell their own story. Oftentimes in our systems, we don't allow for that. Blatt believed, and I think we all do, that people have the right to true stories being told. What's he mean there? He means the authentic person, the endearing traits, that a person is not just a label. The third one is so well stated that we rarely put time and effort into thinking about our communications, but people have the right to artfully and skillfully told stories that affirm their value. Imagine if someone was writing about you and they only focused on the things you weren't good at. Everybody would know I can't do Excel spreadsheets. People have the right to withhold their participation in another story about them. Of course, in our systems, we might say that person is being defiant. They might have a behavioral issue, but we all human beings have the right to withhold that participation. Blatt really cautions us in this next bullet. He says that professionals must be especially aware, vigilant, because we always have our own versions to sell. You can see this anytime a trade organization begins to advocate on behalf of its providers and not people with disabilities. We have versions that we want to sell. You can see anytime there's a funding cut or somebody dares to think about changing services, subminimum wages is a good example. They parade out somebody, a person and their family, and say it's going to be awful if the sheltered workshop closes. So we have to be very vigilant in how we tell stories if we're professionals. We've got to distrust all bad and destructive stories. Blatt is very specific here. He's not saying, well, there might be some truth to that. He's saying all of those bad and destructive stories about a person, we must distrust them. And then finally, that people have the right to communicate their story in various ways. Certainly with augmented communication, behavior is a form of communication with assistance through an advocate, in writing, through sign language, in innumerable ways that people have the right to communicate their own story. These storytelling truths are important because it challenges us to think about what we are communicating through our systems. Well, we wanted to spend time, obviously, on the foundational concepts. but to also then add to this the very, very important role of lived experience. So you could kind of consider this slide a little bit of an audit. So think about this as we cover these areas. First, when you are designing a mission, vision, and values, a brochure to use, a description of your employment services, does someone with lived experience get to have input on that? Anybody that you've helped in employment services, family members, people across the spectrum of disabilities, people with behavioral health disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, to be able to really have some input there. The next thing to do is to think, where and when are you communicating? It's not only when you drop off a brochure or a card or someone covers a story in the local newspaper. You're communicating all the time. And think about, we'll talk about this in this last box here, text box, but what are the latent communications? We're communicating all the time. Where's it happening? A great exercise for this comes from creative writing, where you read your text out loud. Read out what your brochure says, what your card says. Read it to somebody who has no experience in our field. What does it sound like? Does it sound programmatic and human servicey? Is there a lot of system lingo in there? Language that just doesn't make sense to anyone else? Do this several times and you'll begin to have an ear for language that is accessible. And by that, we mean someone can understand what we're talking about versus system human service lingo. There was an organization we also worked with that did a lot of beautiful video work. And we were a little shocked to see that they had covered both what they do in what they call their adult services and mixed in the services for children. That's a no-no, right? Those are different services entirely, different supports entirely. So are the images person-centered, or are they carrying on some of those negative social roles that Nancy mentioned before? And then with that, you want to see, what are you communicating that really is valued? We have to get much more comfortable talking about not only employee and workers and job seekers, but people are taxpayers. They're part of their local economic activity. In the United States, in a capitalistic country, in that kind of economy, that's a powerful social role that's valued. Being able to purchase, to be someone who has power through the pocketbook. But we haven't really helped engage those kinds of socially valued roles. I mentioned we'd talk a little bit about the latent communications. So sometimes there are agency vehicles that already have a logo and the name of the organization right on the van or the car. What are you communicating with that to employers in the community? Business cards, we think are pretty benign, but they end up carrying some strange language from human services as well. Agency newsletters on a consistent basis, what's it communicating? What is it valuing? Is it saying, well, kind of all services we do are equal, or is it putting an emphasis on those socially valued roles? The other thing that I think we've spent some time over the last probably 10 or so years is thinking about, what are we communicating when we have somebody on site supporting a job seeker and learning, using systematic instruction, hopefully using coworkers as natural supports. But what does that communicate? What do all those latent communications say about what we're doing? So just some tips on this slide. You could take it, use it in a staff meeting, ask these questions, do some breakout rooms, and I think you'll get a pretty good quick audit of the kinds of things that you're doing in communications. Well, this is the part where we really wanted to share some of the work that's going on around lived experience at tellthevaluedstory.com. which is an attempt to really focus on making sure that self-advocates, job seekers, writers, journalists, storytellers in print and film are focused on these socially valued roles and telling those stories through the lens of lived experience. So you can go to tellthevaluedstory.com and see that the focus is really on eradicating stereotypes, challenging the purported images of people with disabilities, not only in the public sphere, right, but inside human service bureaucracies, which, to be honest, the National Center on Disability and Journalism seems to care more sometimes about portrayal than the actual human service agencies that receive the funding. So we're going to collaborate around all types of media, small media, from the agency brochure to the front page news story, really making sure that we are, as a community, focusing on the most valued story. Obviously, a big part of that is employment, again, being a taxpayer, someone who participates in the local economic activity where they live. So there's some story auditors there, again, folks with lived experience who will also have some similar training that we're covering here: social role valorization, people first language, person-centered thinking, having the National Center on Disability and Journalism as a resource. And those story auditors will kind of do two things. They can be preemptive. Folks can send their stories, articles, videos, agency communications to a story auditor first to get that feedback from lived experience. And they'll also do some auditing outside of that, finding stories that aren't as artfully and skillfully told as Blatt urged us to do, and reaching out to those media outlets as well. Again, we got to remember that communication happens across a broad spectrum of media. So the first step, obviously, to ensuring that your brochures and the way that you market or edit services really is portrayed with dignity and respect through the lens of folks who have lived experience. It's the best bet to make sure that those stories are told well. Well, we've mentioned the National Center on Disability and Journalism, ncdj.org, which again is tons of information there. And we've talked a little bit about social role valorization. And if you Google, as Nancy said, you'll have tons of information there. There are a couple things that we wanted to mention here as well, that the AAPD does a Storytellers Fellowship. And so if you know of any folks with disabilities who are also storytellers across media, there's a fellowship there that you can easily access as well. Canada has done a real interesting thing on something called DisStory, and it's justice and disability storytelling. What they did is they got together folks with lived experience who had spent times in institutions or congregate settings, sometimes congregate segregated day programs, and things like that. And they really wanted to spend time and effort on focusing on that storytelling. It is heartbreaking to read some of it and see some of it, but it is a wonderful resource as well. Many will probably know about the Crip Camp documentary, and that's certainly something to watch and have discussions around, as well as Intelligent Lives. Both of these documentaries have won awards and brought attention to both lived experience and storytelling, but challenging those images that we have so readily put out there and don't think much about. It's hard to watch either one of these documentaries and then have a conversation without reflecting on, what are the stereotypes that we're reinforcing and where are we helping challenge those? Nancy's going to talk a little bit about some focus groups from the employer perspective that were done back in 2016 by the Lead Center and EconSys. And this really just kind of gets some pointers about what employers expect should be focused on in terms of outreach and engagement.
So, as Doug mentioned, this is a perspective of employers. And what may not be openly shared is when marketing is system centric, disability system centric, it's a turnoff to every business owner or CEO who was a part of the study. They frankly shared that systems who support individuals with disabilities that frame entering the business community and workforce through the lens of the system define us in their minds, meaning the CEOs or the business owners, as oddities. So the other aspects of focusing on employers, and these were employers of various sizes, sectors, and locations who had hired individuals with disabilities into customized jobs. Analyze current marketing approaches and develop strategies that will reflect an increased understanding of factors that contribute to or inhibit successful customization of jobs. Focus on strategies that decrease, and by that we mean fading ourselves out, the role of the job seeker, getting out of the way while meeting the needs of employers. Building benchmarks that focus on organizational performance and employer engagement. And above all, ditch the human service lingo. Again, that's a huge turnoff. Doug's going to wrap up our time together today.
Thank you, Nancy. And of course, that full PDF document will be available as well. It's well worth reading what employers think about provider agencies. These are just a few of the bullets, but there's some real gold nuggets in there as you're planning to hopefully implement some of what we've talked about today in terms of employer engagement. Well, probably no better place to end in terms of imagery in the media than with the brilliant Judy Heumann. Her book and all of her work in this area is just mind-blowing. But Judy was in an interview recently and mentioned that media in all its forms, while improving, they've yet to adequately reflect lived experiences. And I think that's something that's a challenge for all of us, that we have been in control of the way that particularly employment services are communicated to the community at large and with employers. But it's time to change that, right? I think the gold standard should maybe be put a better way, and that it should just be the expectation that employment service providers and the work that they're doing, they have lived experience included in all of that. So we thank you for your time today, and we hope that this is helpful as you think about the way that you engage local employers around both customized employment and supported employment. Thank you.